For decades, gardeners trusted chemical sprays to control pests. But long before Sevin existed, there was a plant that protected crops, improved soil, and required no chemicals at all. It worked so well that people slowly stopped growing it, and almost nobody remembers why. Modern gardening teaches us that pests are an unavoidable problem. When insects appear, the solution is usually a bottle, a spray, or a chemical mix. This idea feels normal today, but it is surprisingly new. For most of history, gardens were protected without synthetic products. Instead of killing insects directly, gardeners shaped the environment itself. Certain plants were placed not for harvest, but for control. Tansy was one of the most common and powerful of these plants. Tansy was not a rare herb or a forgotten curiosity. It was widely grown across Europe and later North America. Farmers planted it along garden borders, near barns, and beside crops. Its strong scent and chemical compounds naturally repelled flies, beetles, ants, and moths. Insects avoided areas where tansy grew. Instead of reacting to infestations, gardeners prevented them. This approach required patience, but it worked quietly and consistently year after year. Unlike modern sprays, tansy did not target a single pest. It altered insect behavior across an entire space. The plant produced bitter compounds that confused feeding and breeding cycles. Flies avoided livestock areas. Moths stayed away from stored grain. Garden beds surrounded by tansy experienced fewer outbreaks. This made it especially valuable before refrigeration and sealed storage existed. Protection was built into the landscape itself, not applied after damage was already done. Tansy's role went beyond pest control. Gardeners also used it as a soil plant. Leaves were cut and laid as mulch, slowly decomposing and returning nutrients to the ground. Some farmers fermented tansy into liquid teas to strengthen soil biology. Others composted it heavily. Over time, tansy-fed soil became darker, more resilient, and less dependent on outside inputs. It was not fertilizer in the modern sense. It was a system component. Because tansy was perennial, it did not need replanting every season. Once established, it returned year after year with little attention. This made it ideal for low-labor gardens and farms. A single planting could provide pest control, biomass for soil, and long-term stability. In an era where labor was limited and chemicals did not exist, this mattered. Tansy reduced work instead of adding steps. That alone made it valuable. So why did a plant this useful disappear from everyday gardens? The answer is not a single ban or secret decision. It was a slow shift. As chemical solutions became cheap and fast, they fit better into an industrial mindset. Sprays promised immediate results. Plants like tansy required planning and time. Over decades, knowledge faded. What once felt normal began to feel unnecessary, then outdated, and finally forgotten. Another reason tansy declined was complexity. It was powerful, but not passive. Used incorrectly, it could spread aggressively. Its compounds are effective, but not meant for careless use. Modern gardening prefers controlled, labeled products with instructions. Tansy demanded understanding. As fewer people learned how to manage it, warnings replaced wisdom. The plant did not change. The relationship with it did. Today, most gardeners encounter tansy only as a weed or a warning label. Rarely is it explained in context. Rarely is its role in older systems discussed, yet the problems it once addressed have not disappeared. Pests are still here. Soil still degrades. Inputs still cost money. The difference is that solutions are now sold instead of grown. Tansy represents a different logic, one based on prevention rather than reaction. This does not mean tansy is a miracle plant or a universal solution. It means it belonged to a system we no longer build. A system where plants worked together, labor was minimized, and control came from structure, not force. Understanding tansy is less about copying the past and more about recovering lost design principles. Principles that modern gardening quietly replaced, but never truly improved upon. Modern pest control is reactive by design. Insects appear, damage happens, then chemicals are applied. This creates a cycle of dependence. Plants like tansy worked differently. They shaped behavior before damage occurred. By influencing scent, taste, and habitat, tansy reduced the likelihood of infestation in the first place. This preventative approach is harder to market, but far more stable over time. Nothing needed to be sprayed, reapplied, or purchased every season. Old gardening manuals describe tansy as a boundary plant. It was rarely planted alone in the center of beds. Instead, it formed living barriers. These borders created zones insects avoided. Crops inside these zones experienced less pressure, not because pests were killed, but because they never settled there. This concept is largely absent from modern gardening advice, which focuses on individual plants instead of spatial design and environmental influence. Chemical sprays simplified responsibility. Instead of understanding ecosystems, gardeners were taught to treat symptoms. This shift reduced skill requirements but increased long-term costs. Tansy required observation, where insects gathered, where wind moved scent, where moisture collected. Growing it well meant learning how a garden functioned as a system. As fewer people practiced this, the knowledge chain broke. Once broken, replacement products filled the gap. It is important to be precise here. Tansy does not eliminate all insects, nor should it. Many beneficial species coexist alongside it. What tansy disrupts are dense, destructive populations. By reducing breeding success and feeding comfort, it limits outbreaks rather than erasing life. This distinction matters. Healthy gardens are balanced, not sterile. Chemical solutions often forget this, creating new problems while solving short-term ones. Another overlooked role of tansy was seasonal timing. It emerged early, before many pests established themselves. This gave it a strategic advantage. By the time insects became active, tansy was already influencing the environment. Modern sprays usually arrive late, after damage is visible. This difference alone explains much of its effectiveness. Prevention happens before problems are obvious. Reaction waits until costs are already paid. As gardening became commercialized, solutions shifted toward repeat sales. A plant planted once and effective for years does not fit that model. Sprays, fertilizers, and treatments do. Tansy did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it did not scale well into a product. Knowledge-based systems are difficult to package. Bottles are easy. Over time, the bottle replaced the plant. There were also safety concerns, often misunderstood. Tansy contains strong compounds and should not be consumed casually. This led to broad warnings instead of clear guidance. Rather than teaching proper use, many sources discouraged it entirely. This pattern repeats often in agricultural history. When knowledge declines, caution becomes prohibition. The plant itself remains unchanged. Only the context around it erodes. In traditional systems, tansy was rarely used alone. It was paired with other plants that supported insects it did not repel. This balance prevented collapse. Modern single-solution thinking struggles with this nuance. A spray either kills or it does not. A plant influences, shifts, and redirects. These effects are harder to measure but more resilient. Gardens built this way failed less dramatically and recovered faster when stressed. Today's gardeners often feel trapped between pests and chemicals. The choice appears binary: spray or lose the crop. Plants like tansy reveal a third option that has been largely forgotten: designing the garden itself as a control mechanism. This requires time, patience, and learning. But once established, it reduces intervention rather than increasing it. The effort moves to the beginning, not repeated endlessly. Understanding tansy is not about nostalgia. It is about recognizing that some solutions were removed not because they failed, but because they did not fit a new economic logic. The plant still grows. The insects still respond. The soil still benefits. What vanished was the system that made sense of it. Recovering that system begins by questioning why we stopped trusting plants to do the work. 7 represents the modern answer to insects. It is fast, measurable, and aggressive. Spray, wait, repeat. For many gardeners, it feels effective because results appear immediately. But those results are temporary. The garden resets back to vulnerability as soon as the chemical fades. Tansy worked on a different timeline. Instead of short bursts of control, it created constant pressure that discouraged pests from ever settling in the first place. Chemical sprays assume pests are an external invasion. Plants like tansy treat them as part of the environment. This difference changes everything. 7 interrupts life cycles through force. Tansy interrupts them through discomfort and displacement. Insects do not adapt easily to avoidance. Over time, populations decline naturally. No resistance builds, no stronger formula is needed. The garden stabilizes instead of escalating into chemical dependence. Another cost rarely discussed is soil impact. Repeated chemical use alters microbial life, often reducing diversity. This weakens plants over time, making them more attractive to pests. It becomes a loop. Tansy, when used as mulch or compost input, adds organic matter and complexity back into the soil. Stronger soil supports stronger plants. Stronger plants require less protection. Control shifts from reaction to resilience. This is why older gardens often looked messier but performed better under stress. They were not optimized for appearance. They were optimized for survival. Tansy fit naturally into this logic. It was tolerated, managed, and respected. Modern gardens often aim for visual perfection and immediate yield. Anything disruptive, slow, or aggressive in growth is removed. Stability is sacrificed for order. If this perspective is new to you, that is not an accident. Gardening education now centers around products, schedules, and interventions. Very little time is spent teaching how plants interact with insects, soil, and each other. If you are finding this idea useful, this channel exists for that reason. Consider subscribing because most of what actually reduces work in a garden is never explained anymore. Using Tansy does not mean abandoning all modern tools. It means shifting priorities. Instead of asking what to spray, the question becomes what to plant and where. Instead of reacting to damage, the goal becomes designing conditions that discourage it. This mindset scales. Whether in a small backyard or a larger plot, structure outperforms treatment when time is measured in years instead of weeks. Historically, Tansy was often planted near entry points, gates, paths, storage areas, and animal shelters. These were high-risk zones for insects. By protecting the edges, the interior stayed calmer. Modern gardens often ignore edges entirely. They focus inward, reacting after pests cross the boundary. Tansy functioned like a passive defense system, always present, always active, never applied in a rush. One reason this approach feels unfamiliar is because it does not promise total control. It promises fewer problems. That distinction matters. Chemical marketing often implies elimination. Real systems aim for balance. Tansy does not kill everything. It shifts pressure. This makes it less dramatic but more reliable. Over time, fewer outbreaks occur, and when they do, recovery is faster and less costly. Seen this way, Tansy is not a replacement for 7. It replaces the need for 7. The difference is subtle but important. One treats symptoms repeatedly. The other changes the conditions that create them. This is why Tansy never fit neatly into modern gardening culture. It asked for understanding instead of consumption. Once that understanding faded, the plant lost its place. Reintroducing Tansy is not about copying the past exactly. It is about recovering lost leverage. Plants that reduce labor, inputs, and fragility are rare. When they exist, they tend to disappear quietly. Not because they fail, but because they do not sell well. Tansy remains a reminder that some of the strongest tools in a garden are living, patient, and largely ignored. Tansy is powerful, but it is not passive. One reason it fell out of favor is misuse. Left unmanaged, it can spread aggressively. Older growers understood this and treated it like a working plant, not an ornament. It was cut back, contained, and harvested regularly. Modern gardeners often remove anything that requires attention. Ironically, that mindset creates more work later through pests and soil decline. Used correctly, Tansy stays where it is invited. Edges, borders, and problem zones are ideal. It does not belong scattered randomly through beds. Its role is strategic, not decorative. When cut and used as mulch, it releases compounds gradually into the soil. This creates localized zones that insects avoid without harming beneficial organisms or collapsing soil biology. Another mistake is expecting immediate results. Chemical sprays train people to expect visible change within hours. Living systems work slower. Tansy builds effect over weeks and months. Insect pressure declines season by season, not overnight. This delay is often mistaken for failure. In reality, it signals that the system is adjusting rather than being shocked into compliance. There is also a safety component often misunderstood. Tansy was respected historically because it was known to be potent. It was not treated casually. It was not fed to livestock in large amounts. It was not consumed without knowledge. Modern bans often arose from misuse rather than danger. Removing knowledge proved easier than teaching restraint. When modern regulators encountered tansy, it did not fit standardized categories. It was not food. It was not medicine. It was not a registered pesticide. Systems built around regulation and sales had no place for it. Instead of adapting frameworks, the plant was sidelined. What remained were products that could be measured, labeled, and sold repeatedly. Ironically, this removal increased dependence on inputs like 7. As natural pressure systems disappeared, outbreaks became more common. Gardens grew cleaner, but weaker. The solution offered was more intervention. Over time, this normalized the idea that protection must always come from a bottle. Plants that quietly reduced problems without purchases were no longer valued. Reintroducing tansy today works best when paired with observation. Watch where pests enter. Notice which plants suffer first. Place tansy near those stress points. Cut it before flowering if spread is a concern. Use leaves as mulch, not as a spray. This mirrors historical use closely and avoids most modern objections. This approach shifts the gardener's role. Instead of reacting weakly, you design once and maintain lightly. Fewer emergencies occur. When damage happens, it stays localized. This is not because tansy is magical, but because systems absorb shock better than isolated plants. That resilience is what modern gardens often lack. It is important to be honest. Tansy will not eliminate every insect. Nothing does. What it offers is stability, fewer outbreaks, slower spread, less panic. Over a season, that difference becomes obvious. Over several seasons, it becomes decisive. This long view is uncomfortable in a culture trained for instant solutions. Plants like tansy challenge the idea that progress always moves forward. Sometimes it narrows. Sometimes useful tools are abandoned because they are inconvenient to explain or control. Rediscovering them requires patience, not nostalgia. The goal is not to reject modern gardening, but to restore lost layers that once made it resilient. Modern gardening often measures success by output and speed. How fast pests die, how quickly plants respond. Tansy does not perform well under these metrics. Its value appears slowly in what does not happen. Fewer infestations, less soil exhaustion, fewer interventions. These absences are hard to market, but they define resilient systems. What tansy offers is not spectacle, but quiet consistency. This explains why tansy survived for centuries without promotion. It was passed through practice, not advertising. Gardeners shared cuttings, not instructions. Knowledge moved locally and informally. When those chains broke, tansy had no defense. It did not advertise itself. It simply waited. The plant never vanished. Only the culture that understood it did. Looking back, the question is not whether tansy works. History answers that clearly. The real question is why modern systems struggle to accommodate plants that reduce dependence instead of increasing it. A solution that asks for observation instead of purchase feels unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean inferior. Often, it means forgotten. Gardens built around sprays assume constant failure. They plan for damage. Systems built around plants like tansy assume recovery and prevention. This difference shapes everything else. Labor decreases. Costs stabilize. Stress drops. The garden becomes less fragile. These outcomes are difficult to attribute to a single action, which makes them easy to overlook. It is tempting to frame tansy as an alternative to a specific product. But that misses the point. Tansy is not a replacement. It is a reminder. A reminder that some problems were once handled structurally, not chemically. When structure disappears, force fills the gap. Reintroducing structure reduces the need for force. This is why debates about banning or discouraging tansy miss the larger issue. The plant itself is neutral. It can be helpful or harmful depending on understanding. Removing it without replacing the system it belonged to only deepens dependence on inputs. Education was replaced by restriction. Simplicity was replaced by control. For modern gardeners, the value of tansy lies in what it teaches. That prevention outperforms reaction. That plants can shape environments. That not every solution needs to be reapplied. These lessons scale beyond a single species. They apply to how gardens are designed, maintained, and understood over time. If this way of thinking resonates, it suggests a different path forward. One where fewer problems are solved by buying stronger tools. Instead, more problems are avoided by designing better systems. Tansy is simply one example. Many others existed and still exist. Rediscovering them requires curiosity rather than compliance. Gardening did not become more complex because nature changed. It became complex because systems were stripped down to products. Rebuilding complexity does not mean making things harder. It means allowing living relationships back into the garden. Tansy represents one of those relationships, waiting quietly at the margins. In the end, the question is not whether you should grow tansy. It is whether you want a garden that depends on constant correction or one that resists problems by design. One path requires endless inputs. The other requires understanding. Plants like tansy reveal that this choice has existed for a long time, even if we forgot it. Tansy was never meant to be the center of attention. It was meant to work in the background, quietly shaping conditions, reducing pressure, and supporting soil health without demanding constant action. Modern gardening often ignores what does not announce itself loudly. But systems that endure are rarely loud. They are subtle, persistent, and forgiving. Tansy belongs to that category of tools that function best when they are barely noticed. When people ask why tansy disappeared, the honest answer is not a single ban or rule. It faded because gardening shifted from systems to products, from understanding to instructions, from patience to speed. In that transition, plants that required context lost relevance. Yet the problems they solved remained. Rising costs, recurring pests, fragile soil, these pressures make forgotten plants worth reconsidering, not romanticizing. A resilient garden is not built by reacting faster. It is built by failing less often. Plants like tansy reduced failure by shaping the environment itself. That idea has never stopped working. It has only stopped being taught. Whether tansy belongs in your garden or not, the principle it represents still does. Designing systems that prevent problems will always outperform fighting them after they appear.